Okay, my next question is about students living in poverty. So it's kind of a little bit of a shift because
Okay.
we know that, I think it's really important to say that culturally and linguistically diverse populations are not necessarily populations of people that are living in poverty.
Correct.
So it's kind of I want to be really clear with people that we're
Yes.
not talking about necessarily the same groups,
Correct.
but that there can be intersection with any group in terms of living in poverty or socioeconomic challenge. So if a student's living in poverty, what are some things that IEP teams and team leaders should keep in mind, particularly as they evaluate and collaborate with the families of those students?
So the first thought that comes to mind is, to your point about being sure that students who may have a special education need are and culturally and linguistically diverse are not necessarily students living in poverty. A recent statistic is that about 2/3 of English learners who tend to be culturally and linguistically diverse families are currently identified as living in poverty. So there is an overlap, but certainly not the same as you pointed out. So in keeping with our asset-based view of students, let's start with paying attention to assets that students would bring, students living in poverty. And one of them, and I think of the 3 R's, right, to kind of help with a mnemonic. So resilience, right? So because of the chronic circumstance of poverty and the stress that typically accompanies living in a consistent state of poverty, students have opportunity to develop resilience over time, and compensatory strategies and workarounds, as we use the term, ways to get what they need. And in terms of getting what they need, there is resourcefulness in terms of who can I go to, what relationships do I have, what resources in the community am I aware of that, if I show up on a Tuesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, I'm likely to have access to nutritious and free food. I'm likely to have access to clothing, seasonally appropriate clothing, and finding those. And then relationships. And students living in poverty by necessity, survival is really supported by the relationships that they're able to develop with peers and also adults. And so that's actually an important resource, an important commitment in schools, is that each student who is living in poverty, who is known to be living in poverty, that's not always obvious, but that there is an effort to connect those students with at least one adult who takes a genuine and personal and sustained interest in the well-being of that student. So first the assets, and then how can we bring to bear those assets on the challenges that students living in poverty, the risk factors, the vulnerabilities that those students are going to experience. So as I mentioned a moment ago, the first is stress. So acute and chronic stress because of the day in and day out experience of living in poverty. Health and safety issues because of either connections to adults, access to food, clothing, shelter, social emotional challenges. We know that students living in poverty may not demonstrate what we developmentally recognize as social skills, interaction, the graces of politeness and interaction. They may be prone to outbursts and other extreme expressions of emotion that tell you that their resources for self-regulation are not yet fully developed. And then the fourth would be cognitive lags, because research has shown a demonstrable experience with far less language, less complex and less rich language than the language of typically experienced by students living in middle income and upper income families. They don't have access, they typically have less access and less experience with the content, the concepts, the vocabulary associated with a range of knowledge and experiences that middle income and upper income students would experience. Then the opportunities for problem solving, the opportunities for higher order and more complex thinking may not be as abundant in the daily experience of a student living in poverty. So all that is to say that if we pay attention to the etiology, right, the origins of whatever behaviors have brought the student to the IEP team, the child study team, if we keep in mind these circumstances, we have a better opportunity to possibly identify those as circumstances that through which we can intervene, right, through high quality instruction and building relationships and building background knowledge, rather than the over-identification and assuming or attributing these behaviors to a disability.
So it sounds like what you're emphasizing is that when we're an if I'm an IEP team leader, and I'm aware that a student is experiencing these conditions that
Yes.
can be associated with poverty, that I am really careful to guide the whole team around their awareness of these
Yes.
things and the differences between the impact of these circumstances and a disabling condition.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
Well